The Adelaide fiasco, the issue of state borders, reminds us how quickly premiers will move on the smallest numbers. Meantime, the New South Wales Premier wants more migrants and international students coming in for an economic boost. Quite the contrast with the other knee-jerk reactions we're seeing from state leaders.
We saw a tragic farce being played out last week in South Australia, Kieran. The Premier locked down the entire state on the basis of a lie told by one person who worked in a pizza shop. And due diligence was not done properly before this decision was taken. And then, of course, in predictable terms, we saw border closures against South Australia led by Queensland and Western Australia. We have to get beyond the point where complete lockdowns and border closures are no more than a routine tactic in terms of handling breakouts. And here, I think the most appropriate comment was made by the New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian when she warned that lives and livelihoods were now being destroyed at a whim. And that was a direct criticism of her fellow premiers. And of course, we know that the decision of National Cabinet is to try and open up borders before Christmas. The New South Wales Premier also indicated that she wanted some of hotel quarantine to be used for international students and migrant workers needed to come to this country. I think that comment is a welcome comment because it opens a discussion we have to have about the international border and about opening up Australia in a very cautious way to the rest of the world. Again, we'll have to see the way that plays out. But I think the New South Wales Premier has demonstrated that she's the most responsible and practical Premier when it comes to handling these issues.
On the retirement income report, now, what's the government's plan after the findings, particularly on superannuation? What are they going to do on that?
I think the government has no plan, Kieran. The government's plan is wait and see. Let's put the decision off. Let's take it next year. There's no doubt that this report lays the foundation for a very substantial government policy change on superannuation, and it makes 2 points in particular. It argues that increasing the superannuation guarantee from 9.5% to 12% will come at the cost of wages and living standards here and now. And secondly, it argues that the cost of tax concessions to the current super system, which are highly inequitable, will be more over a period of time than the cost of the age pension. So that lays the foundation for a significant policy change. If the government decides such a policy change is worthwhile and it's prepared to run the political risk, and that is the fundamental decision here. Have no doubt, what this decision will do, if the Morrison government decides to embark upon it, is it will give a sense of mission to a fairly demoralised federal Labor Party. It will unite Labor, the unions and the industry super funds in the biggest campaign we've seen against a coalition policy decision since work choices. So I stress the point that the Morrison government doesn't have to do this. It has a policy argument to do it. It's got to weigh up how important this policy change is, given the enormity of the political risk it would run.
Yep, and there is certainly that enormous risk, as you say. Now, speaking of risk, your piece in the paper yesterday on the China relationship explored with nuance and realism the state of play. Where to from here?
Well, last week, Kieran, we had good news on Japan and more bad news on China. The good news on Japan was Scott Morrison went to Tokyo, had a successful meeting with the new Japanese Prime Minister and concluded a military agreement, which is significant. The bad news on China is that the Chinese Foreign Ministry and the Chinese Embassy in Canberra continued and escalated their rhetorical campaign against Australia, which of course is reinforced by their trade retaliation against Australia. And we are in real difficulty now with China. Scott Morrison responded in a predictable and justified manner, saying that Australia would not be intimidated, that we would not sacrifice our democracy, our values, our core policies in the teeth of this intimidation from China. But that's too easy. That stance is popular. While it's necessary, it's also popular. And the problem is that domestic politics are now playing right into this issue. Now, the truth is that it is not in Australia's national interest to have China continue this campaign against us. It is not in our national interest to have China as our potential enemy. It is not in our national interest to have China retaliating against Australia if that retaliation is greater than what it's exercising against other countries. So we've got to consider how and where we draw a line in the sand here. I think we need to be very careful about taking further action against China. And we need to assess what's happened over the course of the last year or two, because it's completely false to think that we are some innocent party here and that the strategic reassessment in which we've engaged against China has all been innocent on our part without any mistakes on our part. We have made mistakes. We need to assess what they are and we need to correct our course. Now, I say that fully cognizant of the fact that China is essentially to blame for the deterioration in the relationship. But the fact that China is to blame does not excuse us from better policies in the future than what we've displayed in the past.
Yeah, well said, Paul. And finally, on the United States, Joe Biden trying to get on with it despite the lack of cooperation from Donald Trump.
Well, Donald Trump won't cooperate in this transition. He says the election is stolen. The Trump administration continues with all its illegal action. The Biden administration cannot get proper briefs in terms of organising the transition, and this is terribly important in terms of combating the virus and devising a new national policy against the virus. Biden has called Trump's tactics incredibly irresponsible. If anything, that's an understatement. This is a very dangerous time for the United States. Polls show that about half Republican voters believe that this election is stolen. That is a very risky and very dangerous situation for the country. And of course, the big question is what else Trump does to further sabotage this transition.
Yeah, indeed. The unknown. Paul, thank you so much for that.